She had left no farewell, no letter, no ribbon, no pressed flower tucked between the pages of a book he might one day open. There was only the cold, vast silence of Ashford Manor in the grey hours of a November morning, and the hollow, echoing realization that struck Edmund Cavendish, the 7th Duke of Ashford, like a blow across the chest, that the woman he had sacrificed everything to defeat had been, all along, the only soul in all of England who had ever truly, unconditionally, and without reservation, loved him. He stood in his library. The fire had burned itself down to embers some time in the night, and the room held a chill that no amount of wool or brandy could fully banish. The tall windows, dressed in their heavy velvet draping of deepest burgundy, rattled faintly against an October wind that had mistaken November for its own. Candles, 3 of them, had guttered and gone dark upon the mantelpiece, leaving only the faintest traces of smoke curling upward into the shadows, like the last whispers of something that had once been warm. Upon his mahogany writing desk lay the document, crisp, official, sealed with the unmistakable insignia of the Court of Chancery. His victory, his triumph, the case of Ashford versus Hartwell, concluded, resolved, won. And yet the Duke of Ashford had never felt so utterly, irreparably defeated in all of his 36 years upon this earth. But before we travel deeper into the ruin of this man's heart, I must pause and speak directly to you, dear listener. If you are new to the Duke's lost letters, then welcome. Welcome to a world of candlelit drawing rooms, of whispered declarations and devastating silences, of love found and love shattered in the most breathtaking of fashions. Every week, we bring you the most immersive Regency-era stories your heart can bear, stories of passion, propriety, and the terrible cost of pride. If this story moves you, if it stirs something within you, I humbly ask that you take a single moment to press the like button below. It costs you nothing, but it means the world to this channel. And if you have not yet subscribed to the Duke's Lost Letters, please do so now. Press that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so that you shall never miss a single story. We are a community of romantics, of dreamers, of those who believe that love, even when it is lost, is the most magnificent thing a human heart can hold. Join us. You belong here. Now, let us return to Ashford Manor, where a duke stands alone with his victory, and where a story that began 3 months prior is only now beginning to reveal its true and devastating cost. It had started, as so many catastrophes do, with a letter. 3 months before that cold November morning, Edmund had been a different creature entirely. Or rather, he had believed himself to be. He had believed himself to be a man of reason, of discipline, of unyielding principle. He had governed his estates with an iron hand and a meticulous ledger. He had attended Parliament with regularity and spoken with an authority that commanded the attention of lords twice his age. He had never, not once in his adult life, permitted sentiment to govern his decisions. He had believed in the comfortable arrogance of a man who has never been truly tested, that he was incapable of loving anyone at all. Miss Vivienne Hartwell had quite efficiently demolished that particular illusion. She had arrived in his life that August, during the height of the season, when London shimmered under an uncharacteristic warmth, and the great houses of Mayfair threw open their doors to a relentless parade of balls, soirees, and morning calls. She had come to London as the companion of Lady Dorothea Pembridge, a distant cousin of moderate fortune and immoderate humour. Vivienne was not an heiress. She was not the daughter of a duke or a marquess. She was, by all accounts of the ton, a gentlewoman of middling circumstance, the daughter of the late Reverend Charles Hartwell of Derbyshire, educated beyond her station, possessed of a wit that was rather too sharp for drawing-rooms, and entirely too honest for her own comfort. Edmund had met her at the Pemberton Musicale on the 14th of August. He had not wished to attend. He rarely wished to attend anything, and his attendance at such events was governed entirely by obligation and the relentless pressure of his aunt, Lady Cecily Ashford, who harbored the singular and apparently indestructible conviction that Edmund required a wife. "You are becoming a gargoyle," Lady Cecily informed him with characteristic delicacy over breakfast that morning, "perched atop your great stone manor, frightening away every eligible creature within 30 miles. It is most unbecoming of a duke." He had gone to the Pemberton Musicale. He had positioned himself near the window, a glass of claret in hand, wearing the expression of a man silently calculating how many minutes must pass before his departure would be considered an insult. And then Vivienne Hartwell had seated herself at the pianoforte. She had not played with the careful, practiced perfection of a young lady who has been instructed in musicianship since the age of 6. She had played with feeling. There was a difference, a vast and oceanic difference, and Edmund, who had sat through a great many accomplished performances without the slightest stirring of his soul, had felt something shift within him. Something ancient and stubborn and long calcified had cracked, just slightly, as her fingers moved across the keys and the notes filled the room, not with demonstration, but with genuine, unguarded emotion. He had watched her. She had not looked up. She had played as though she were entirely alone, as though the room full of London's finest were nothing more than furniture, and the music were a private conversation between herself and some unseen presence. When she finished, the applause had been polite and general. Edmund had not applauded. He had simply continued to watch her, with an expression he did not yet have a name for, as she rose from the bench and found herself face to face with Lady Cecily Ashford, who had been, as it transpired, acquainted with her late father. "My nephew," Lady Cecily had announced, with the triumphant air of a general who had maneuvered her troops to precisely the right position, "the Duke of Ashford. Edmund, this is Miss Vivienne Hartwell. She plays quite magnificently, does she not?" "She plays honestly," Edmund had said, which was not the compliment most young ladies expected, and he had watched, with something dangerously close to interest, as Vivienne Hartwell had tilted her head to one side and regarded him with clear, dark eyes that held no trace of the flustered deference he was accustomed to receiving. "Honestly," she had repeated, as though testing the word. "Most people say beautifully, Your Grace. They do not say honestly." "Most people," Edmund had replied, "are not listening closely enough." It was, he would reflect later, much later, in that cold library, with his victory document upon his desk and the ashes of his fire at his feet, the most consequential thing he had ever said. The weeks that followed were, by the standards of a man who had never permitted himself to be moved by anything, a quiet revolution. He had not sought her out precisely. He was too proud for that, too conscious of the dignity of his position and the impropriety of a duke visibly pursuing a woman without fortune or family connection. But he had found himself, with increasing frequency, in the same rooms, at the same gatherings, gravitating toward the same corner of whatever drawing-room fate and Lady Cecily's machinations placed them in. He had found himself looking for her dark eyes across crowded ballrooms. He had found himself at his own dinner table, hearing something she had said 3 days prior and feeling a new appreciation for its cleverness. He had found himself, most alarmingly, smiling. and not the controlled politic smile of a duke fulfilling social obligation, but the involuntary, unguarded smile of a man who has been genuinely surprised by delight. Vivienne, for her part, had treated him neither with the obsequious reverence that his title commanded from most of society, nor with the calculated flirtation of those who saw in him primarily a fortune and an estate. She had treated him as a person, a specific, particular person, one whom she observed with the same clear-eyed honesty with which she had played the pianoforte that first night. "You are lonely," she had told him once, as they walked in the garden at a Kensington house party, a full 3 feet of propriety between them, and Lady Cecily strategically positioned within sight, if not quite within hearing. "I do not say it to wound you, Your Grace. I say it because I think no one around you ever says the true things, and I believe it must be extraordinarily exhausting to live amongst people who never say the true things." He had stopped walking. He had looked at her for a long moment, this woman in her lavender silk gown, this woman without title or fortune or connection, this woman who seemed entirely unintimidated by the weight of his consequence, and he had felt, with a clarity that frightened him considerably, that she was the truest thing he had encountered in a very long time. "You are impertinent, Miss Hartwell," he had said at last. "Yes, Your Grace," she had agreed without the slightest remorse. He had almost taken her hand. But there is, in every story of love and pride, a complication, and the complication that entered Edmund's life in late September arrived in the form of a document delivered by a courier from the office of his solicitor, Mr. Aldous Price, on a Tuesday afternoon when Edmund had been in the very agreeable occupation of composing a letter he was not yet entirely sure he had the courage to send. The document was a copy of a deed of trust, a deed pertaining to a parcel of Ashford land in Derbyshire, the very land upon which, as it so happened, the late Reverend Charles Hartwell had built his rectory. The land which had, upon the Reverend's death, been understood by his daughter to belong, by right of an old verbal agreement between the Reverend and the late 5th Duke of Ashford, to the Hartwell family. The land which now, according to Edmund's own solicitor, belonged entirely and unambiguously to the Duchy of Ashford. The verbal agreement, Mr. Price explained in his precise and unsparing letter, had never been formalized. It had never been committed to writing. In the eyes of the law, in the eyes of any court in England, it did not exist. The land was Ashford land. It had always been Ashford land. And if Miss Hartwell, who had been quietly receiving a small income from the tenancy of said land for the past 3 years, income which she believed to be rightfully hers, continued to do so, she was, in the strictest legal interpretation, receiving Ashford funds without entitlement. Edmund had sat with that document for a long time. He was a duke. He was a man of principle, of order, of the law. The law was clear. The land was his. The income was his. And Miss Hartwell, his Miss Hartwell, though he had not yet permitted himself that possessive, not quite, had been the unwitting beneficiary of an error. He should have gone to her. He should have spoken to her directly, privately, as a man speaks to a woman he regards with esteem and something far deeper. He should have told her what his solicitor had found, listened to her account, sought a private arrangement that spared her dignity and protected her circumstances. He should have been, in short, the kind of man she had told him he could be. He had gone instead to Mr. Price, and he had said, in the voice of the Duke of Ashford, cold, correct, and final, "Proceed."
And now, dear listeners, if you have been with us since the beginning of this story, I thank you from the deepest part of my heart. We are now some way into our tale, and I must once again pause to ask, if you have not yet subscribed to the Duke's Lost Letters, please do so this very moment. This channel exists for you, for every soul who believes that love stories, even the painful ones, are worth hearing in full. Subscribe, leave us a comment below telling us what you feel for Edmund in this moment. Sympathy? Fury? Both? And let us continue together into the darkest and most beautiful part of this story. The case had proceeded swiftly, as cases involving dukes and their solicitors tended to do. The Court of Chancery was not unsympathetic to wealth. The Hartwell position, presented by a young and earnest barrister who had done his honest best, had rested entirely upon the verbal agreement, upon the honor of the late 5th Duke, upon 30 years of uncontested custom. It had no documentation. It had no witnesses still living who could testify to its specific terms. It had, in the merciless arithmetic of English law, nothing. Vivienne had attended 2 of the hearings. Edmund had known she would be there, and he had told himself, with the rigorous self-deception of a man who suspects he is doing something unconscionable but cannot bring himself to stop, that he had not looked for her in the gallery, but he had known, with some peripheral sense that seemed to operate independently of his will, the precise moment she entered, the exact position she occupied, and the stillness with which she sat as the proceedings unfolded. She had not wept. He had somehow known she would not. She was too proud for that, too fundamentally honest to perform distress. She had sat with her spine very straight and her hands very still in her lap, and she had watched the barrister make his insufficient arguments, and she had, once, only once, for a single unguarded moment, turned her gaze toward the Ashford bench where Edmund sat beside Mr. Price, and their eyes had met across the width of that great wood-panelled room. He had looked away first. He was not certain he had ever done anything in his life of which he was less proud. The judgment had come on the 28th of October. It had been, as every competent legal mind in London had predicted from the outset, entirely in the Duke of Ashford's favour. The land was confirmed as Ashford property. The income paid to Miss Hartwell over the preceding 3 years was to be repaid at a rate and schedule to be negotiated by the respective parties. The verbal agreement, lacking all evidence of its existence, was deemed, with the law's particular talent for elegant brutality, as if it had never been made. Edmund had received the news in his solicitor's offices. He had nodded. He had shaken Mr. Price's hand. He had said, "Thank you," in a voice that conveyed neither triumph nor its absence, and then he had stepped out into the sharp October air of Chancery Lane, and he had stood there for a long moment, watching the carriages pass, and he had understood, with the sudden, terrible clarity of a man who has waited too long to understand anything, what he had done. He had won. He had won, and it had cost him everything. He had gone to Pembridge House that same afternoon. Lady Dorothea had received him in the drawing-room, had received him with a look of such cold composure that it told him before a single word was spoken that he had arrived too late. "Miss Hartwell," he had said, and his voice, to his own private astonishment, had held something that very nearly resembled uncertainty, "is not here," Lady Dorothea had replied, in the same tone one might use to inform a person that the weather was inclement and would likely remain so. "She received word last week that the old rectory, the rectory, Your Grace, where her father preached for 31 years, where she was born, where her mother died, where every memory she possesses of her early life is rooted, is to be let to new tenants at Ashford's earliest convenience." Lady Dorothea's voice was controlled, precise, and more devastating than any open accusation could have been.
Edmund had stood in that drawing-room, surrounded by the cheerful furnishings of a house that had been kind to him, and he had felt something inside him fold in on itself, like a piece of paper held too close to a flame. Did she— He stopped, began again. Did she leave no message? Lady Dorothea had looked at him for a long moment. There was neither malice nor compassion in her expression, only the clear-eyed assessment of a woman who has watched a great stupidity unfold and declines to soften its conclusion. She said, Lady Dorothea replied at last, that she hoped you would be very pleased with your land. He had left for Derbyshire that same evening. His valet had packed with the efficiency of a man long accustomed to his master's sudden and inexplicable decisions. His coachman had been roused from a comfortable fireside without complaint, being paid handsomely enough that surprise had long since featured in his professional repertoire. And Edmund, the 7th Duke of Ashford, victor in the case Ashford versus Hartwell, had ridden north through the night in a carriage that was the finest money could purchase, wrapped in a greatcoat lined with the softest wool available to English commerce, and had felt as cold and as lost as a man adrift in open water. He had thought, in the long and sleepless hours of that night journey, about honesty, about a woman who had said to him, in a garden fragrant with late summer roses, that he was lonely, and that it must be exhausting to live amongst people who never said the true things. He had thought about the pianoforte, and a piece of music played not for display, but for the pure private necessity of expression. He had thought about dark eyes that had met his in a courtroom, and held no anger, only something far more difficult to bear, a grief so dignified it did not ask for his acknowledgment, and a disappointment so complete that it asked for nothing at all. He had thought, as the miles unspooled beneath the carriage wheels, and the countryside darkened from autumn brown to the cold grey of approaching winter, about what it meant to win something, about what victory looked like, measured not against the opposing barrister's arguments, but against the total sum of what one had possessed, and what one in the process of winning had permanently lost. He had arrived in the village of Ashburn, Derbyshire, at just past 7 in the morning. The rectory, a modest, handsome building of warm limestone, set behind a stone wall and overlooked by the ancient church where Reverend Hartwell had ministered for 30 decades, was quiet in the early light. But a lamp burned in the downstairs window, and Edmund, who had never in his life arrived unannounced at any door below his own station, had climbed down from his carriage, walked up the stone path through the gate, and knocked. She had opened the door herself. She was dressed simply, in a gown of dove grey, her dark hair unpinned and loose about her shoulders, in a manner she would never have permitted herself in London. A detail that told him, more plainly than anything else could have, that she had not expected to see him, or indeed anyone, this morning. In one hand she held a small leather-bound book, in the other a candle, though the growing light of the November morning made it nearly unnecessary. For a long moment neither of them spoke. The November air moved between them, cold and clean, and smelling of frost-bitten leaves and the distant wood smoke of the village. "Your Grace," she said at last. Her voice was very steady. "Miss Hartwell." His was not, quite. She regarded him with those clear, honest eyes that had looked at him across a crowded musicale and seen, apparently from the very first, exactly what he was. And then she stepped back, not in welcome precisely, but in the wordless acknowledgment that they were not yet finished with each other, and she held the door open. He went in. The interior of the rectory was modest in its dimensions, but warm in its character, the character of a home that had been genuinely loved by those who inhabited it. The walls held bookshelves packed without particular orderliness, volumes of divinity and natural philosophy and poetry, all pressed together without regard for propriety of subject. A writing desk stood in the corner, its surface bare save for a half-finished letter and an ink-pot. On the mantelpiece, above a small and well-tended fire, there was a miniature portrait of a man in clerical dress, her father, Edmund recognized, from the shape of the eyes. She did not offer him tea. She did not ask him to sit. She stood in the center of the room with her book held against her chest like a shield, and she looked at him, and she waited. "I came," he began, and then stopped, because he had, in the long nocturnal hours of that carriage journey, composed and discarded no fewer than 9 separate approaches to this conversation, and none of them, not one, felt equal to the moment or to her. "Why?" she asked. Her voice was quiet, not cold, not accusatory, not the voice of a woman performing her hurt for an audience, simply a woman asking a single, entirely reasonable question of a man who had once made her feel seen and then proceeded to make her invisible before a court of law. "I was wrong," he said. The words, when they came plainly. They were not the elegant, calibrated speech of a duke accustomed to being correct in all things. They were simply the truth, the bald, undecorated, slightly desperate truth offered by a man who had spent 36 years mastering the art of authority, and only recently discovered that authority was no substitute whatsoever for the harder, rarer thing he had never permitted himself to practice. "My father," she said after a long pause, in a voice that was very steady, with someone who is being careful not to break, "shook hands with your grandfather, 2 men who trusted that a handshake between gentlemen was sufficient. My father gave 31 years of his ministry to this parish. He was buried in that churchyard." She gestured, very slightly, toward the window, toward the ancient church visible through the frost-rimed glass. "He believed he had provided for me. He died believing it." "I know," Edmund said. "Do you?" Her eyes met his, and they were not cold. They were luminous with a grief too large and too long held for cold. "Do you know what it is to have the only security you possess stripped away by the letter of a law that recognizes no loyalty, no history, no 30 years of faithful service? Do you know what it is to sit in that courtroom and listen to your whole inheritance, not the money, your grace, not the pounds and shillings, but the meaning, the legacy, the proof that your father's life mattered, be reduced to a filing error?" He did not answer immediately. He owed her the dignity of his silence, of letting the full weight of her words settle upon him without the defense of response. "No," he said at last, and his voice was very low. "I do not know that. I have only known this past night what it is to understand, too late and at the cost of everything, that I could have prevented it, that I had the power to repair what I have broken. The income that was stopped, it shall be restored and backdated. The tenants, the new tenants for the rectory, they have not yet been confirmed. The rectory may remain at your disposal for your lifetime, at no cost and on no condition, if you will accept it. These things I can do. These things," he added quietly, "I should have offered before any court was ever involved." Something moved across her countenance, something swift and complex, like clouds crossing a sky in which the sun has not yet decided whether to appear. "This is very generous, Your Grace," she said, and there was a careful neutrality in her tone that told him with some relief that she was at least still speaking to him in the key of possible resolution, rather than the key of permanent severance. "It is not generous," Edmund said. "It is merely just, and justice, I am rather belatedly acknowledging, is the minimum one owes to a person, particularly a person to whom one has given every reason to expect something considerably more." He paused. "I am not good at this," he added with a directness that surprised even himself. "I am not practiced in the articulation of—" He paused again, and the silence held all the words he had not yet found the correct shape for. "Of what?" she asked softly. and Edmund Cavendish, the 7th Duke of Ashford, who had governed 30,000 acres of England's finest land, who had sat in the House of Lords and commanded the attention of courts and ministers, who in 36 years had never once permitted the machinery of his interior life to run without the governor of his pride firmly engaged, took a breath and said, very quietly, "Of caring for someone more than I care for being right."
The room was very still. Outside, a robin sang briefly in the rectory garden and then stopped, as though it too were listening for what came next. Vivienne Hartwell looked at him, and then, slowly, not with the brightness of forgiveness easily granted, but with the deliberate, careful grace of a woman who has assessed the truth of a thing and found it, despite all her better arguments against it, to be genuine, she set her small leather book down upon the writing desk, and she said, her voice not quite steady now for the first time in this entire encounter, "Then perhaps, Your Grace, you might wish to sit down. The fire is small, but it is warm, and I believe we have a great deal left to say to one another." He sat down, and for the first time since he had received that document from his solicitor, for the first time perhaps in many years before that, Edmund Ashford set aside the armor of his title and his pride and his relentless need for correctness, and permitted himself simply to be present in a room, beside a fire, with the only person in England who had ever looked at him and told the true things. They spoke for 2 hours. The morning light strengthened and shifted across the stone floor of the rectory, moving from the pale silver of early November to the warmer gold of mid-morning as the frost outside began, degree by degree, to concede to the sun. Tea was eventually made by Vivienne herself in the small kitchen, while Edmund sat in the Reverend's old armchair and looked at the bookshelves, and felt, with a sensation he could not name with any word he knew, except perhaps homecoming, that this modest, book-crowded, history-saturated room was the most comfortable space he had occupied in a very long time. She told him about her father, about the Sunday sermons he had prepared with such earnestness, and the parishioners he had known by name for decades, and the long winter evenings when he had read to her by lamplight from the natural philosophers he so admired, about what it had meant to her after his death to remain in this place, to continue his small legacy, to keep his memory present in the landscape that had held his life's work. He listened. He listened in the manner of a man learning, perhaps for the first time, that listening is not a passive occupation, but an active gift, that to truly receive another person's history, with all its weight and particularity, without the interference of one's own judgment or one's own impatience to arrive at a conclusion, is one of the rarer and more significant things one human being can offer another. And in return, haltingly, in the manner of a man dismantling a fortification, brick by careful brick, he told her something of himself, of the expectations that had shaped him, of the loneliness that she had, with her impertinent and perfect accuracy, identified in that August garden, of the uncle who had managed his estates and ruled his childhood with a cold efficiency that had taught him to mistake control for character, of the years of careful, correct, relentlessly composed adulthood that had left him at 36, master of everything and intimate of no one. She listened, and when he stopped speaking, she said very quietly, "I did not stop what I felt because of the case." He looked at her. "I was angry. I am, still, a little. I may be angry for some time yet. I think that is honest. But I did not stop." She met his gaze with that directness he had loved from the very first night, that radical, uncommon honesty that refused all social pretense. "I was afraid," he said, that I had been too late. You were nearly too late, she said, with the ghost of something that might in time become a smile. You were very nearly indeed too late, Your Grace. Edmund, he said. A pause, brief, weighted, warm. Edmund, she agreed.
The formal matters were arranged in the weeks that followed through the offices of a rather bewildered Mr. Price, who had not anticipated that the triumphant conclusion of the case of Ashford versus Hartwell would result in his client immediately providing the defeated party with a lifetime lease on contested property and a considerable annual income guaranteed in perpetuity. Mr. Price was a solicitor of great experience and adaptability, however, and he adjusted his professional expression accordingly. Society, for its part, was fascinated. The Ton observed with the avid attention it brought to all things that combined romance, scandal, and a reversal of legal fortune, as the Duke of Ashford was seen with increasing frequency in the company of Miss Vivienne Hartwell, at first at carefully chaperoned occasions, then at Lady Cecily's dinner table, then at the opera, then at a morning walk in the park conducted with an entirely insufficient degree of separation for a couple who had not yet announced their formal understanding. Lady Cecily, for her part, looked at the situation with the satisfied expression of a chess player whose opponent has, after considerable unnecessary delay, finally made the correct and inevitable move. I knew, she informed Edmund over breakfast, approximately 6 weeks after his return from Derbyshire, the moment I introduced you, that she was precisely what was required, a woman who would say the true things. I knew nothing of the kind, Edmund replied, but without particular conviction. I am your aunt, Lady Cecily said, with finality. I always know. The betrothal was announced in December, in the bitter cold of a winter that had arrived with unusual severity and unusual beauty. Frost on every window, snow in the parks, London stilled to a hush beneath its white weight. It was announced quietly, without great ceremony, at Lady Cecily's house, to a small gathering of those who had, already, in the manner of London's finest observers, suspected such for some considerable time. Vivienne received the congratulations of this gathering with a grace that was entirely her own, not the practiced, performed composure of a woman trained to the demands of society, but the genuine, warm, somewhat amused composure of a woman who is genuinely happy and is not inclined to pretend otherwise. Edmund stood beside her, and felt, though he would not have used this word aloud, being still in many respects very much the man he had always been, felt something that the poets had always insisted was real, and that he had spent 36 years successfully doubting the existence of. He felt at peace. They were married in March in the old church at Ashburn, Derbyshire, the same church visible through the rectory window, the same churchyard where Reverend Charles Hartwell lay beneath a modest stone that said simply, "He served faithfully." It was a small wedding, attended by those who mattered, Lady Cecily in her finest pelisse, Lady Dorothea Pembridge in a hat of extraordinary architectural ambition, and the parishioners of Ashburn, who had known Vivienne since her childhood, and regarded this development with the whole-hearted approval of people who had always known she deserved something magnificent. Edmund stood at the altar and watched her come up the aisle on the arm of her father's oldest friend, and he thought, with the particular clarity of a moment that is too significant for sentimentality, but too significant also for restraint, that this was the truest thing he had ever participated in, not a transaction, not a strategic alliance, not a social arrangement, but a covenant in the oldest and most honest sense of the word, between two particular people who had chosen each other not for convenience or calculation, but because they had each, in their very different ways, recognized in the other something too rare and too essential to forfeit. He had won a case and nearly lost the most important thing in his life. He had, at the last possible moment, understood the difference between what the law could give him and what only the most humbling and honest portion of his own character could earn. He had learned at the age of 36 that to be right is a small and unsatisfying victory, but to be worthy of being loved by someone who loves honestly, that is the only triumph worth the having. And so we leave Edmund and Vivienne here, dear listeners, in the spring light of a Derbyshire morning, in the churchyard where a faithful man was laid to rest, and where his daughter, who learned from him to say the true things, is beginning the truest chapter of her story. This has been the Duke's Lost Letters. I am so grateful, so genuinely and deeply grateful that you spent this time with us today. If this story moved you, if it stirred you, if you felt yourself on Vivienne's side or Edmund's, or if you felt, as I hope you did, the full and aching beauty of two people who almost missed each other, finding their way at last, please leave us a comment. Tell us your thoughts. Tell us who you loved, who frustrated you, which moment struck the deepest chord. And if you are not yet a subscriber to this channel, please, I am asking you from the heart, press that subscribe button now. Ring the notification bell. Share this story with someone you love or someone you think might need to hear it. Every single one of you who watches, who listens, who returns week after week to this little world of silk and candlelight and impossible love, you are the reason this channel exists. We shall have another story for you very soon. Until then, be honest, be brave, say the true things. Good day, dear listeners. Good day.